Okay, hello. Welcome to the Quadruple D. Today we're going to be talking about tariffs, some of Trump's creepy aliases, and also Ivana Trump's iffy death. So, to start with, I'm going to have to get a little bit potentially boring here by talking about economics, but President Trump has granted Mexico a 90-day extension to finalize a trade deal before imposing higher punitive tariffs. At least that's what the media are saying at this moment. And this pushes the deadline beyond an already extended timeline. So, fun, fun, fun. Trump called his conversation with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum very successful, citing the complexity of U.S. Mexico border issues, mainly immigration and drug trafficking, as justification for the drawn out negotiations. He also claimed Mexico agreed to remove unspecified non tariff trade barriers, which could mean anything from rolling back regulations to weakening labor or safety standards, though no details were provided. In other words, more deregulation, more letting corporations get away with abuse, if that is what they want. And the extension is part of Trump's broader so called Liberation Day tariff campaign. Blanket tariffs of 10 to 25% on global imports, potentially rising to 50% for nations with trade deficits. And that's because Trump doesn't understand that trade deficits are not necessarily bad. It doesn't necessarily mean a country is in a bad spot or putting another country in a bad spot. Trade deficits can actually be relatively neutral, but he sees the word deficit and he's like, oh, that's a bad thing, or something like that. Anyway, I don't really know what his rationale is, but that seems to be the case, that he sees the word deficit and he's like, oh, that's bad. But many of these threats have been followed by similar 90-day delays to allow more time for deals or something like that. Again, it's hard to know exactly what his rationale is. However, the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that Trump's tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA, very, very snappy name for something, right? But anyway, that exceeded legal limits and it was considered federal overreach. And the U.S. Court of International Trade has ordered refunds. A federal appeals court has paused that ruling pending further review, but the tariffs have been deemed legally questionable. And Trump's move fits a similar pattern: threats, deadlines, delays, and deal making, or at least in some cases claiming to have made deals. And critics see it as not being genuine negotiation, but as a strange tactic to manipulate markets and control trade relations, leveraging emergency laws to centralize power and coerce foreign partners. Canada is also under tariff threat up to 35%. And what is their apparent crime? Well, they're refusing to delay recognition of a Palestinian state, illustrating how Trump is tying foreign policy positions to trade punishments and doing the will of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is actually one of his main paymasters, or prominent figures who are linked to the Israeli government. And this strategy also resembles coercive diplomacy more than reciprocal trade. Tariffs and manufactured crises serve as leverage, especially against smaller or economically dependent countries. So that is most certainly what he is trying to do. Not going in there as sort of an honest actor, but trying to make chaos and draw more power out of the situation. So Trump has blamed Mexico, China, and Canada for America's fentanyl crisis, using it to justify hardline train and or trade. Let me try that again. Hardline trade and border policies. But most fentanyl precursors come from Asia, not Mexico, and U.S. overdose rates reflect deeper systemic failures in healthcare, law enforcement, and economics. So the claim that Mexico will eliminate non tariff barriers likely means deregulating in ways that favor U.S. corporations, often at the expense of environmental standards, labor rights, or food safety. So he's gonna hide that fact under the fears about fentanyl and whatnot. But make no mistake, things like food safety and labor rights and environmental international standards are going to be under threat here more than uh, practically anything else. That is one of the key reasons, and in many ways, the fentanyl thing is going to be a way to distract from that because, for one thing, you're probably never going to get rid of the drug problem, and it's been a sort of smokescreen of hysteria since the Nixon era, where the war on drugs really started to take off. And in this case, it's being used again to hide the greater agenda here, which is to get rid of international rights and standards, for ordinary citizens like workers and consumers. So Trump's trade tactics mix economic nationalism with executive overreach, and of course, he's not even truly a nationalist in any pure sense because he's serving international corporations and international interests that happen to be fascistic in nature. And he's using legal gray zones and crisis framing to force international concessions and consolidate domestic corporate power. Whew. So yeah, I just hope some of you understand that out there what is actually going on. So okay, moving on to a more fun topic for the week. I'm going to be talking about John Barron, one of Trump's aliases, and I'm going to also discuss a few other ones that he's used. And I'm kind of cheating this week because this segment is my peripheral poop head of the week. Somebody who's on the periphery of things, who's not really receiving wide coverage. In this case, we're actually making it a fictional character, an alias. But oddly enough, there really is something to that when he was calling himself these different names. So it was really, in a weird way, the use of a pseudonym as a power play whenever he would do these things. So Donald Trump spent much of the 1980s communicating with the media under the alias John Barron, and he sometimes spelled Barron with one R, other times with two R's. And interestingly enough, keep in mind, he later on named his son Barron as the first name. So that's a pretty strong hint right off the bat that yes, this was Donald Trump playing games uh, while talking to the media. This invented figure functioned as a faux vice president of the Trump organization, a PR frontman that Trump deployed when scrutiny turned intense, and when he wanted to sound tough, or simply to deliver pompadoured messages without attaching his own name to them. So there was sort of a plausible deniability aspect to it, which is strange enough. The first known use appeared on May 7th, 1980, when John Barron told reporters of a possible $1 billion deal to buy the World Trade Center. He said at the time, I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but it is a possibility. Of course, it never did happen, and we all know how the World Trade Center actually what was no longer something that you'd be able to buy. Let's just put it like that. And a month later, after he told reporters that, on June 6, 1980, the Alias defended Trump's demolition of two Art Deco sculptures and those are promised to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So, it was an alias that he used. Um, he's claiming that Trump was out of town or something like that, and very strange. And over the decade, Barron showed up in numerous episodes, spinning failure of a Trump Castle project as strategic sales, pressuring U.S. Football League owners in 1985 to reimburse him for the high priced Doug Flutie, and announcing deals such as the attempted Atlantic City Hilton purchase, all while the man behind the alias remained Trump himself. In a 1990 court deposition regarding undocumented Polish workers at Trump Tower, Trump admitted under oath that, quote, I believe on occasion I use that name, the name of John Barron, which effectively ended the Barron mystique. So, yeah, keep in mind that in 1990 he was using undocumented Polish workers at Trump Tower. So he was doing the very same type of thing that he's bashing others for doing. Of course, because that's every conservative, every person on the far right, they're a hypocrite about usually way more than one thing. I'll just put it like that. And there were fraudulent wealth claims and Forbes deception. In May 1984, Jonathan Greenberg, then a 25-year-old Forbes researcher working on the Forbes 400 list, received a call from Barron, who of course is Trump himself, insisting that Trump controlled, quote, in excess of 90%, end quote, of his father Fred Trump's real estate empire, dramatically inflating his wealth in the process. At this point in time, Forbes had ranked Donald Trump with approximately $100 million, far less than the $500 million Barron claimed. And over time, Greenberg discovered Trump's true net worth was closer to $5 million, and that he had no ownership of Fred's holdings until inheriting a portion from Fred's death in 1999, and even then only as one of multiple heirs. So you're getting a little bit more into the psychology of why he was doing this, to just inflate his own ego, but he apparently at the time knew that it would probably look bad if he was the only one doing that, if he was building himself up to that degree. So there's a weird psychological need he must have felt to invent some alter egos to do this. And there are more. I'm going to get into these other names that he was applying to. But Greenberg later published the original audio tapes and concluded that Trump had lied significantly to get on the list, and analysts today agree that he should not have appeared on the Forbes 400 at all, at least until much later. So there's the use of these aliases to promote power, myth, and misdirection as strategic tools to help the Trump brand. And the Barron charade exemplifies how elites can manipulate public perception, shaping mythologies to actually consolidate power over time. Trump shadowed his own identity to manufacture authority, if you think about it. The Baron alias served as propaganda, a persona of detachment that allowed crude self-promotion and deception while maintaining plausible deniability, because he would literally deny in many instances that it was him who was behind this this talk. And such tactics recall how capitalist figures throughout time shield themselves behind intermediaries and spin control. Trump's use of Baron arguably enabled him to evade direct responsibility for misleading claims, shifting accountability to a fictional spokesperson while inflating his social and financial capital. And his wholesome exaggeration of wealth, you know, the uh, the way that he promotes it like it's a virtue, built on loans, family money, trust funds, and inheritance, shows how capitalist myth making erases collective labor and redistribution in favor of individualistic myths of self made success. That's another dynamic here. He was never truly a self made man. In fact, even if you really think about it, all of these rags to riches stories that are authentic, that are really about people who are more self made, even they have their success rooted in society in general. The workers that they hire, the consumers who pay for the products that are made, they're actually just as big a part, if not the biggest part, of this whole formula of the mythic self made millionaire or billionaire, what have you. So that often gets lost in the fog, the fact that it's actually not just one person or one small group of people making the system work and making these success stories. It's actually everyday people, who work and sell and buy products. That's really the major part of success that a lot of this myth making cynically swats aside. And people out there, they really shouldn't be forgetting that. And here's an interesting one. It's sort of a strange side note, but it's probably the most funny and, in some ways, actually most disturbing aspect of this story, or aspects of this story. The way that Madonna was used along with these pseudonyms. So Trump, through another alias, John Miller, you know, oddly, he chose the name John again, but for some reason chose to call it Miller. But anyway, this was after the Barron claims unraveled, apparently. But John Miller once told a People magazine reporter that various actresses were attracted to him. In that voice, he claimed Madonna had wanted to go out with him, a peculiar boast to convey glamour and desirability. Though entirely self invented, Madonna would go on to say that she did not have such an exchange with Trump where she wanted to go out with him. And Trump, as John Miller, claimed he's got zero interest in Madonna when he was sort of on the defense about this. It's suggested that he was too good for Madonna. And remember, through much of the 80s and the 90s, Madonna was considered one of the sexiest celebrities on earth. And here he is saying that, oh no, I rejected her, she didn't reject me. And that's totally on brand for Trump because he's such an egomaniac. You know, like honestly, how many men out there would have turned down Madonna, especially at her peak in the 80s and 90s? Uh, I think very few heterosexual men would have turned her down. Now, obviously, if you're if you're not a heterosexual man, you're probably going to be able to have a much easier time. But you know what? At the time of her success, I'm just going to say it. Even some gay dudes probably would have signed up for that because she was just so famous. That was like the height of, I guess, Madonna mania or whatever it would be called. Yet here's Trump saying that he rejected her. So Trump even had a made up female persona called Carolyn Gallego, or Gallego, I guess That's how it's pronounced. But Trump claimed that she was his secretary, and she boasted in a letter, she with parentheses boasted in a letter to New York Magazine, quote, I do not believe any man in America gets more calls from women wanting to see him, meet him, or go out with him. The most beautiful women, the most successful women, all women love Donald Trump, supposedly said Carolyn Gallego. So the language use there, the repetition, the whole pattern, that really just matches Trump's speaking style. So it's obvious that it was actually him writing that. I'm sorry, but I just can't help but find some humor in that. It's just so pathetic. The man is like a cartoon character. He's self parody, and it's very dark at the same time that he does stuff or did stuff like this. Well, he still does it. He still does it. But it just goes to show you how he's always been something like this. And these stories, Barron rejecting Madonna, changing names from Barron to Miller, they were consistently told in the third person, as if endorsing the spectacle of Trump's fame and sexual allure, because again, there must have been at the time a psychological need to make it look like it wasn't him praising himself. But obviously, as he's cultivated a cult over the years, he's feeling less of a need to actually do that. And the voices were confirmed as Trump's own by analysts, reporters, and audio experts. And this is a strange story that you should look into because there are more details than I've provided. And all right, the third segment of today's episode, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And this time we're going to be looking at Ivana Trump's death. A bit of a dark topic, but also a bit of a fever dream. And we're not so much making fun of Ivana Trump here. She was the first wife of Donald Trump. She's not been directly tied to any major public scandal on the level of some other figures in Trump world. She lived a highly visible life as a socialite and businesswoman, but no verified sources link her to something like Jeffrey Epstein's criminal network, at least as far as I know. There might be some implications there, but I'm not too keen on getting into rumors on this. There's also no public record of her being involved in any of Epstein's dealings or, as far as I know, the trafficking operations or even the inner circle. So I do want to make that clear. And that said, we can discuss two areas of controversy that are sometimes framed as suspicious or questionable, at least by me, and I know other people find it questionable as well. So, number one, the burial at Trump National Golf Club. Ivana Trump died on July 14th, 2022, reportedly from blunt force trauma after falling down the stairs at her Manhattan home. She was 73 years old. Her sudden death was ruled accidental. Shortly after, Donald Trump had her buried at his Bedminster golf course in New Jersey near the first hole. So the grave is plain, isolated, and odd for someone of her stature. You have to wonder, why was she buried in a golf course? Was she actually that big of a fan of golf? Well, it turns out that New Jersey law grants tax breaks to land designated as a cemetery. A cemetery of one or more plots can potentially reduce property, income, and sales taxes. So Trump's critics feel that the burial may serve as a financial loophole, and of course, that raises ethical questions. And speaking of ethical questions, you also have the allegations that came out during their divorce proceedings. During her 1992 divorce from Donald Trump, Ivana accused him of rape in a sworn deposition, a claim she later walked back, stating she didn't mean it literally. So the episode resurfaced during Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, though Ivana said they had a good relationship and she supported him. But there was also a non disclosure agreement which said that she was not able to talk about those allegations. So that matters. The allegation reflects power dynamics and legal maneuvering, often shielded by wealth. It's a snapshot of how violence and control can be dismissed or recontextualized in elite circles, in this case, through the use of non disclosure agreements. And Ivana Trump's life and death, they're really a case study in how elite privilege operates in some key ways, right? There is wealth being used as powerful armor. Ivana lived inside the machinery of capitalism and patriarchal worldviews. She represents a lot of the things that those wacky feminists critique about the world. Her public role as Trump's wife, sort of a trophy wife, it became a brand, then a commodity. Her status offered her protection from some legal scrutiny if she was ever to get in trouble with the law, but it actually also did more to protect Donald himself, seen in how serious allegations like the rape claim were softened and buried in PR and non disclosure agreements. So, angle number two is that the burial was used as a tax shelter. That's another example of how this is a case study in how elite privilege can operate. The use of a grave that is human remains as a tool of capitalist optimization, it aligns with critiques of how the rich can twist legal frameworks for personal gain. And in this case, it's a twisted legal framework because it involves exploiting somebody's death, you know? And Ivana's grave is not a resting place, but a financial instrument, a grotesque symbol of how even death becomes property under capitalism. So, angle number three is that, there's death without transparency here. Her sudden death, ruled accidental but never investigated beyond that, it feeds skepticism of how state institutions and the medical and legal apparatus often protect the elite while criminalizing the poor. In this case, there was no eyebrow raised about how her death might have been suspicious or anything like that. Given the previous accusations that the very public previous accusations that he was a rapist. And there's no conspiracy theory here. This is public information, and it's a pattern. One law for the rich, another for everyone else. So, this whole thing about, you know, a rich guy uh, and his wife suddenly dying by falling down the stairs and her being buried in one of his golf courses, it sounds like an episode out of the Forensic Files. So, I mean, that's all public information. I'm not lying here. It's not just a conspiracy theory. It's what happened. You have to wonder, like, why wasn't there more of an investigation? And why weren't more eyebrows raised? But anyway, he's president now, so the Epstein connection, none is known to involve her, but the Epstein connection with Donald Trump is, of course, very well known. And yeah, so, that's a pretty dark thing. And anyway, Ivana Trump was not central to any major scandal involving criminal conduct, at least not that I'm aware of. And her life, and especially her death and burial, really go to show the bizarre and morally bankrupt ways that elite systems can operate, from tax loopholes disguised as family mourning to legal systems built to absorb and deflect accountability and suspicion. It's a pretty dark thing to look at, really. And yeah, it's another thing that I think really was not properly investigated.